I always say tariffs is the most beautiful word to me in the dictionary. Then I was reprimanded by the fake news. They said, what about love, religion, and God? I said, I agree. Let's put God number one. Let's put religion number two. Love, I don't know. We got to put that number three, I guess, right? And then it's tariff. Because tariffs are going to make us rich as hell. It's going to bring our country's businesses back that left us.
Welcome to the Expert Series, where we explore the issues shaping Canadian national defense and security. I'm Josh Malm, Director of Research and Analysis for the CDA Institute. Today, on a special episode of the Expert Series, we're going to discuss the implications of President Trump's threats to impose tariffs on Canada, what is driving this administration's use of tariffs more broadly, the impact on our bilateral relationship, the North American and global economy, and the potential geopolitical and global trade consequences of this shift in U.S. policy. I'll be joined by Assistant Professor at Carleton University and expert in U.S. foreign policy, Dr. Aaron Ettinger, CG Senior Fellow Dan Ciuriak, Chief Economist for BMO Financial Group, Douglas Porter, and Chair of the Political Science Department at University of Laval, Eric Duchesne. This episode is a little longer than usual, so we encourage you to skip ahead to the segments you're most interested in if you don't have the time, but rest assured, it's a worthwhile listen. This is the Expert Series. Canada obviously is facing tariffs with the United States. As our audience will no doubt remember, just a few weeks ago, we were initially threatened with the 25% across the board tariffs that was dropped. And then just this Monday, we were slapped with 25% tariffs on our steel. And the tariff issue is not over. We have the premiers in Washington right now, or rather yesterday, speaking with their counterparts in Washington, trying to get Canada a deal. And the whole tariff issue might be revisited at the end of February. So with all this said, I'm wondering if you can touch on what is driving this push towards using tariffs in the United States, not only against Canada, but against other allies. I'm wondering if you might be able to flesh out what, if any, strategy is being employed in DC or in this administration.
All right. So I'm going to do a little bit of Donald Trump saying washing for a moment here, right? Because it's not necessarily the case that he has a clear, means to ends rationality behind this whole tariff strategy. So, okay, let's think as if this is a rational decision-making process that's going on. Right. So Donald Trump and the economic nationalists in the United States have this notion that the United States is subject to unfavorable terms of trade vis-a-vis its trade partners around the world. Right, and that's certainly the case with regards to China, but not necessarily with Europe or Canada. Anyway, their whole point is that they want to repatriate American manufacturing to the United States, which will have beneficial outcomes for middle class people there, workers in Ohio, steel workers in Pennsylvania, all of that kind of stuff. Now that fits in with a very long intellectual tradition and political tradition of economic nationalism. But whether or not they're actually thinking in those terms is a whole other story. Now, some of the more thoughtful members of the American right wing recognize that, tariff will do things like spur domestic growth, right? That is a very long history of economic protectionism being used to incubate infant industries, right? Developing countries did that for a long, long time. The United States in the 1800s did that, as did Germany. Right? They are, following a very long tradition of that kind of economic policy. Now, that's the kind of rational approach to things here. Then there is the Trumpian approach. And my sense of things is that Donald Trump is fired up more by his intuitions than by any sort of intellectual calculation. And Donald Trump's intuitions are all about winning and asserting dominance, right? Winning for the sake of winning. And in his mind, slapping tariffs on trade partners in order to win is the objective unto itself. Whether or not it actually yields economic benefits domestically is largely a question that he probably doesn't think too much about. And so, in that sense, we have a series of possible justifications for the same policy, right? Different ways, different reasons, different ways of getting to tariffs that happen to align in the current moment, but are not necessarily intellectually consistent or even particularly thoughtful about what comes next.
Well, thank you for that overview, Aaron. I think that's a great introduction. Now, something no doubt on a lot of people's minds listening is this whole 51st state business. So you just mentioned that you're saying watching Trump, which means I think, you know, I think that implies really that even for a lot of experts and onlookers, Trump is just very difficult to parse. We can't with certainty really kind of suss out what exactly he is thinking all the time. With that said, he has said many times Canada would make a great 51st state. Yesterday, I think the premiers met with some of their counterparts in Washington and asked them to forward messages to Trump. And one of those messages is Canada will never be the 51st state. And I think one of those counterparts in Washington clarified to CBC or another news outlet that he, quote unquote, never made any promises that Canada would be the 51st state. So, I mean, you can tell, is this very elaborate trolling? Is it the way Trump does business? Or is it quite possible that, they may very well like to annex Canada in some form?
My sense is that this is all just, like you said, trolling. This is just made up. This is just Donald Trump talking trash because that's what he does. It is a way of winning. It is a way of belittling his opponent. And that's about it. I mean, it's almost an intellectual embarrassment that we have to even talk about this or take it seriously. Uh, I think Canadian leaders have responded appropriately by really not taking the bait about the 51st state. They'll say, yes, Canada's never going to become a 51st state, and then proceed to talk about the stuff that is actually consequential, which is the economic upheavals that are going to follow the trade war that is coming up. And now, okay, so Trump may be, he may be making this all up as he goes along in order to be insulting and in order to play that role that he so loves to play, and that is received very, very well by Republican Party supporters. The sane washing component of this is that, maybe this is a way, this is a way of getting negotiating leverage, bargaining leverage, right? Maybe, he'll drop the whole 51st state threat if Canada concedes on something else. Maybe. Like that is a way of suggesting that there's a sort of means to ends rationality in this multi-stage game of North American bargaining. Maybe. We don't really know this. We're going to find out. But my sense right now is that nobody in Canada really takes the 51st state stuff seriously. And if that's the case, we're essentially treating it as a bluff and moving on to the stuff that is truly consequential.
Uh, if the administration does go ahead with its planned tariffs, there's been a lot of talk about how Canada would respond. How do you think Canada could effectively respond? And if indeed they are serious about these tariffs, how can, keeping in mind that Canada can never really decouple itself entirely from the United States because of our shared geography, et cetera, how can Canada hedge a bit against a United States that might be perceived as not as good of a trading partner or perhaps a little unreliable, at least at this point in its history?
Canada hedges by diversifying, by doing open trade relations with Europe, with East Asia, with other parts of the world. And we've been doing that for the last 15 or so years, even longer, right? I think the Stephen Harper conservatives negotiated the Canada EU free trade agreement, and that was finalized under the current liberal government in its early years. We have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or whatever it's called, and it ended up becoming called, right? So there is an effort to diversify Canada's export economy, and appropriately so. But 75% of Canada's exports or thereabouts go to the United States. And you can't diversify away from that kind of dependency. Even if we cut that export dependency in half, it would still represent like a stunning dependency on the United States, one that is not particularly sustainable in a period when we can't trust that the Americans aren't just going to pull the rug out from underneath us. So the question then becomes, what does Canada do in the short term? Well, in the short term, Canada's going to have to suck it up and experience a great deal of economic pain. Right? American tariffs on Canadian goods is going to result in collapsing demand for Canadian-made products. There's going to be lost jobs. There's going to be economic hardship in manufacturing towns. Retaliatory tariffs from Canada are going to result in higher prices for stuff on Canadian shelves. And it's going to mean hard times for people in a period where things are already very hard. But the thing is that Canada and Canadians know what their advantage is vis-a-vis the United States. Now, we know we're not going to win in the slugfest, right, over the long term with the United States, but we do understand Americans, right? That's one of the benefits of living next door to Americans. You understand how they tick. So Canada's strategy should, at least in my view, be about retaliation with clarity about what the consequences are going to be for ourselves and for the Americans. And the Americans have two weaknesses. One is the fact that its population really can't sustain the pain, right? Americans don't like paying money for a lot of money for things, right? And so they cannot take the economic pain. And the kind of repatriation of American industry that we are imputing on Trump's motive is going to take a generation, right? You don't just undo 60 years of integrated auto industry production in a couple of years, right? It's going to hurt. And it's going to hurt Americans such that they will punish the Republican Party at the polls in the midterm elections, right? As we're talking about this, the midterm elections are only 20 or so months away. And then that's the second weakness that the Americans have right now, which is time. Canada isn't playing necessarily a long game. Canada is seeking to exert as much pressure at the pain points, the pressure points within the next 20 to 22 months leading up to the November 2026 midterm elections. And so that's Canada's strategy, right? Retaliate with as much pain as possible so that American politicians do something to chasten Donald Trump, and so that American voters punish the Republican Party.
Aaron, thanks for your time today, and thanks for providing some of your insights and analysis. We met with Dan Ciuriak to discuss the impact of President Trump's trade policies, focusing on tariffs and their consequences for Canada and North America. Dan explained the motivations behind U.S. tariffs, the economic challenges they present, and the potential long-term implications for Canada's trade strategy and global competitiveness. Dan, thanks for joining us today. Great to have you on. How did we get here to where we are in this situation where Canada is potentially in a trade war, or at least a tit-for-tat tariff spat with the United States? And, what is the thinking in the current U.S. administration in terms of tariffs? What is the modus operandi here?
Okay, so Mr. Trump likes tariffs. He's liked them all his life, and he's surrounded by thinkers, and in fact, in American society, who have determined or analyzed America's problems as being driven by their trade deficit in industrial goods, in manufactured goods. They attribute to this deficit a loss of national security, or a weakening of national security because of the loss of learning by doing, benefits from doing things, from building things. And they attribute also this trade deficit to job losses in small towns that then have led to social problems such as the deaths of despair, the fentanyl abuse, and so forth. So that's the big picture. Overlaid on this is a transactional thing. Mr. Trump uses tariff threats to exact concessions from his trading partners, and that this goes back to his background as a businessman in real estate. So the 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum were intended to drive production of steel and aluminum that is intended for the U.S. market into the U.S. market. So he does not want to import this from Canada or from Europe or Turkey or anybody else. The tariff threat um, goes towards a range of other industries. For example, automobiles. Canada produces a lot of automobiles, which are primarily intended for export to the United States. Meanwhile, we import most of our automobiles from the United States. So there's a heavy two-way trade. But some of the most popular US brands or models are produced in Canada. So the use of the tariff threat by Mr. Trump then drives the auto companies to give production mandates inside the United States and withdraw them from Canada. He has said publicly that, with a stroke of the pen, he can basically bankrupt Canada and drive all this activity into the United States. So that's the second kind of broad motivation. But there's a third one, and a fourth one. I'll get to the fourth one next. The third one is drives the thinking behind the reciprocal tariff. You may have heard of this recently. This is apparently the one that's going to go up next. And this basically says that different countries have got different tariffs, different levels of tariffs. And this has been the case since the very beginning of the post World War II trading system under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, and later under the WTO. The WTO permits different countries to have different levels of tariffs. What the liberalization over the post-war period aimed at was to have a symmetrical lowering of the trade barriers, but not to the same point, but just a similar degree of liberalization. So everyone's got different tariffs. The Europeans, for example, have a 10% general tariff on automobile imports. The United States has a 2.5% on most automotive imports, but they have a 25% tariff on pickup trucks. So countries have different tariffs. Now, Mr. Trump is proposing that America will, instead of offering their tariff, their most favored nation tariff to everybody, they will actually impose on a country by country basis the same tariffs as the other countries apply to the United States. So, for example, India, which has got a high tariff profile, will now face a much higher tariff rate for their exports to the United States. The same would be true for Brazil, Malaysia, and others. Canada, of course, charges zero for imports from the United States. So we will get a zero tariff under this policy, but let's hold our breath on that one. It definitely will not be the case with steel and aluminum. And then there's the fourth one. There's the fourth tariff motivation is the revenue motive. Back in the day, in Alexander Hamilton's time, and there's a lot of people sort of talking originalist sort of economics, where they go back and say to Alexander Hamilton had an industrial policy. He had tariffs, and the United States government used to fund itself from the revenue from tariffs. So, but if you go back to Alexander Hamilton's time, this is in the 1780s, 1790s. This is before the Industrial Revolution. Manufacturing was artisanal. It was small family owned businesses or joint partnerships. There was no economic scale. Alexander Hamilton's tariff had 20 lines or so. We have, 10, 15,000 tariff lines today. It's a completely different world. So there is this, nonetheless, there's this view that America can, by putting, say, 10% or 15% or 20% tariffs on everybody, that it can fund the operations of the United States government from this and not have to use income taxes or sales taxes, which is the case today. So those are that's the basic motivation for a variety of reasons. But one of the bottom lines for Canada is that almost regardless of which tariff motivation, apart from the reciprocal one, we get hit by new tariffs
Oh, thank you for that overview, Dan. That's a fantastic place to start. I want to kind of pivot to the potential impacts on Canada now and North America more generally. If Canada and the U.S. were to enter a kind of prolonged tit for tat trade war, what might be the best case scenario for Canada in the long terms, in the long term, in terms of negotiating with the United States in the future? And what are the broader implications maybe for North America?
Well, I think in terms of North America, I don't think there is any more a North America. Back in the day when we had Brian Mulroney and Ronald Reagan and Salinas, the Mexican president, getting up on stage and talking about themselves as the three amigos, where we built things together. This was in the establishment of the North American Free Trade Agreement or NAFTA. That those days are gone. We're no longer in the business of producing things together. We are now in a quite adversarial situation and being pressured on by the Americans on a variety of fronts, including on defense, including on the border, interdiction of fentanyl flows and illegal immigration and money laundering and other things. But very definitely, there's a sense of grievance coming from the American administration, and the question is, how do we respond? And do we actually believe that the complaints that they are bringing against us are real, and that we should meet them all the way in terms of making changes to it, the way that we do our affairs to accommodate their concerns? In some of these areas, for example, the interdiction of fentanyl flows and illegal immigration, the flows on the Canadian-U.S. border are tiny, and they're certainly not material to the issues that the U.S. Has. And also, we have flows coming north. The net flow is not clear that there's any net flow one way or the other. It's really small. There are many people who consider that Canada is as a sort of a global hotbed for money laundering, and the U.S. just imposed a $2 or $3 billion fine on Toronto Dominion Bank for having allowed some money laundering to flow through its accounts. And banks use algorithms to determine what are suspicious flows, and then they crack down on those. And the TD's algorithm apparently was the too lax. So there are those concerns, and those are concerns that I think the Canadian government will definitely try and, as I said, meet the Americans all the way. They would take action to put a Black Hawk helicopters on the border, new sort of infrared sensing to detect any bodies moving across the border and so forth. Um, uh, this won't change anything materially for the United States, but so it's performative in that sense. But Canada will take those measures and highlight the actions in Washington, and hope that that will lead the tariff threats, the 25% across the board tariff threat, to be removed. Let's see if that happens. And that's a legitimate perspective from the Canadian point of view. Is you have to at least be on the surface of things to be accommodative. It's not clear that that's the real motivation for Mr. Trump. He also has this economic coercion that he wants to apply to force Canada into basically giving up its sovereignty and becoming the 51st U.S. state. And now been a very, very visceral reaction against that in Canada. And if you saw some of the hockey games where the crowd was singing the Canadian national anthem, the place just was in uproar after the singing of that national anthem. So there's a lot of patriotism being expressed in Canada against that notion. And, various Canadian figures from Stephen Harper and others have basically said, protecting our sovereignty is the most important thing. So there is that kind of background. We're not sure whether what he's saying about Canada is actually the real story, or if it's just a bargaining ploy. Now, you asked about whether or not, like, what's the best case for Canada? Well, supposing that we actually are faced with a 25% across the board tariff, we have had various studies from the Bank of Canada, the major Canadian banks, and others. And typically, they tell us that about the two to 3% decline in real GDP would be anticipated from this tariff alone. Regardless of, if we retaliate, it gets worse actually for us because then we sort of double the pain. But let's just take the tariff itself at 2.5% GDP loss. Since our natural growth rate is about 2%, that translates out to about a minus 0.5% hit to GDP in 2025 if the tariffs go up and stay up all year. So what Canadians can expect then from this is that we will be 99.5% as wealthy in 2025 as we were in 2024. That doesn't sound like a big deal, does it? I mean, it's a recession, so people are losing jobs. More companies are closing their doors. And so there is a challenge to be faced by the Canadian government in combating this, but it's not the end of the world. That's the first point to take note. The tariff threats are doing something else to Canada. They are causing companies to think about whether or not to uproot and move to the United States so that they get around this tariff threat permanently. So Canada will be facing a potential bleeding away of its companies, and this is actually a more serious concern to me than is the actual, perhaps some decline in current economic activity across the board. Companies are where GDP gets done. If you think about the source of production in Canada, almost all production in Canada is inside a company. So if you're losing companies, then you're losing capabilities to produce GDP. So we would need to move very, very forcefully and quickly to arrest any such bleeding away of our companies, of the companies that are established in Canada. And this could include anything up to nationalization of major plants that are being considered for transfer out of the country, so that we would treat this as a matter of national security, national economic security, and that would be one of the approaches that might be taken by Canada. I don't know if this is actually being considered in the halls of government, but that is a true major concern for us. We do not want to lose our capabilities. As long as we retain our capabilities, we can continue to produce and continue to thrive, regardless of the tariff on the border. So that would be the my main reaction would be we do face very stiff headwinds in terms of growing in 2025, but we also have the ability, both through fiscal policy stimulus, monetary policy stimulus, to limit that damage. And if we take resolute measures on safeguarding our corporate assets, then we will actually retain the productive capabilities to grow once we get past this first shock.
Given our long-standing alliance and trade partnership with the United States, how significant are these latest developments in our relationship? And from there, do you see this maybe, although it's hard to predict, do you see this as maybe a temporary kind of era in United States foreign and economic policy, or could this be a longer-term trajectory for the United States? What does it spell for the CUSMA renegotiations, if they're happening at all? And what might it spell for the future of our relationship?
So, I mean, in terms of the CUSMA or the USMCA, that of course is the successor to the NAFTA agreement, which itself was the successor to the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement of 1989. So we've been basically in a free trade arrangement with the United States for over 35 years. Uh, and our production structure has adapted to that, as has the US production structure. And I'll give you an example of how this adaptation has occurred. I was involved in the first steel and aluminum tariff, TIF, and included the safeguards that Canada was putting up in place on imports of steel products because of the diversion of trade that the American tariffs were causing other countries to, find new markets. And that could include us, right? So what do we learn? We learned that we have multinational steel producers on both sides of the border. They specialize in different dyes, in different thicknesses, and the characteristics of wire, of rod, of the rebar that goes into reinforcing concrete, and so forth. And the Canadian plants serve the North American market in the specifications that they have, and the U.S. plants serve the North American market in the specifications that they have. When the tariffs went up on both sides of the border, first of all, the clients continue to buy from the companies that they were buying from, regardless of the tariff. One reason for that is because if you think about a Christian project, right? A 20, $30 million mall or something's going up. And the cost of the rebar that goes into the concrete is tiny. It's absolutely infinitesimal compared to the overall project. So the companies are not going to blink an eye at paying 25% more for that tiny source of product that they need to keep their schedule on to keep their project on schedule. So this in economic terms, this is to say that the price elasticity of these products is almost zero. There's no reaction in demand to the higher price. 25% tariff goes up, same demand, the steel continues to flow across the border. The second thing that we found was that once the tariff goes up, on the U.S. side, they had 207,000 requests in the first 2 or 3 years, and this is a study by the General Accounting Office of the United States. 207,000 requests for exemptions from the tariff. And so what effectively happened was that tariff wall was basically Swiss cheese. Okay, there were so many holes were punched in it for product to flow through without the tariff, that it really did diminish the overall impact of that tariff. And then, of course, after 3 or 4 months, we negotiated away the tariff altogether between Canada and the United States, and we thought we had a deal, and that deal was in the USMCA, that we would restrain the amount of exports that we sent to the United States in exchange for having tariff-free access to the sort of average flow. So that's kind of how the world adapts. Okay, in the first case, you trade continues, and then you get the exemption request and so forth. There's another sort of a case which is useful to consider, and that is like consumer products. Think about a T-shirt, which may cost $1 at the factory level to make. So at the factory gate, it's $1. Gets to the U.S. border, a 25% tariff goes on. It's now up to 125. It's shipped to a retailer in the U.S. and gets marked up to $9.99 for sale to the consumer. So between $1.25 and $9.99 is a lot of markup, and that's why these things also go on sale at deep discounts. So the question is, would this stop? And the answer is no. That trade would continue, and the retailer would absorb the part of that cost. The exchange rate in Canada will also be depressed because of these tariffs. So that actually makes us more competitive, and helps us to sustain our export flow to the United States. So if you take all these margins of adjustment, what you see is then that trade does continue to flow. We do face headwinds, but it's not the end of the world. And at the end of the day, the question is, do we negotiate a new free trade agreement with the United States, or at least with President Trump, whose word obviously is not his bond? And we may very well go through that exercise, and whether that is performative, whether it's a charade, whether it's for real, I leave that to the beholder to think about. But the long story, to make a long story short, trade will continue. We will continue to be heavily reliant on the U.S. market. We will continue to be subject to threats. But if we think about how to grow our economy independently of any concerns about restrictions of access to the United States, we do have a path forward, and that is by building companies that serve the global market, and particularly in areas like technology and services where there are no tariffs. So, my own take on all this is that I'm not optimistic that there is going to be a realistic or meaningful trade agreement with the United States. There might be something. I don't know what the value of that will be. If it removes the tariffs, at least temporarily, that's not bad. It will remove the adjustment pressure on Canada. But in the longer run, Canada has to be cognizant of the fact that the there is a groundswell of opinion in the United States now that does not look at trade favorably, and they are looking to pull in their raise the drawbridges and take care of themselves and damn the rest of the world. And so, in that kind of a context, the Canada has to also look for other markets. Small open economies like Canada cannot pull up the drawbridges. If you think about Iceland, okay, 330,000 population, they have got a per capita GDP the equivalent to ourselves to the United States. That's only possible through trade. We're not quite as dependent upon trade as Iceland, but we are still very, very dependent upon it. So we have to then arrange our affairs to embrace trade and do so in a context where a major trading partner is not so keen on it and essentially has taken his ball and wants to go home and take care of its own issues on its own. So that's kind of my story on that. I don't think that we're going back to where we were with Ronald Reagan and Brian Mulroney and President Salinas, three amigos. That was a one-time event. We're in a different world today, and we have to make adjustments.
For this episode, we also met with Chief Economist at BMO Financial Group, Douglas Porter. Mr. Porter discusses the potential economic impact of a 25% tariff on Canadian non-energy exports, which could result in a 2.5% decline in Canada's economy in the first year. He also highlighted the significant regional and industry-specific impacts, including the auto, aerospace, and manufacturing sectors. And he also discussed the importance of diversifying trade partners and strengthening our economy amidst these growing tensions. I note that this segment was recorded just after the tariff announcement a few weeks ago. How would you assess maybe the immediate and long-term economic consequences for Canada if a 25% tariff on Canadian non-energy exports were to go through?
Well, it's really challenging. And, of course, almost from the day that Mr. Trump threatened Canada and Mexico with 25% tariffs, of course, this has been a cottage industry in a serious way among economists trying to work out what kind of impact that would have on Canada. And, even the Bank of Canada took a crack at what a, full trade war with 25% tariffs and full retaliation would mean. And they came up with roughly a 2.5% decline in the Canadian economy in the first year and about 1.5% in the second year. What was proposed this past weekend was a little less severe because of the 10% lighter tariff on energy and not a full retaliation by Canada. And we were assuming that it would subtract about 2 percentage points from growth. So heading into this, we had thought the Canadian economy was going to grow by about 2% after inflation this year. In the event of this fairly serious, but a little bit more limited trade war, we were looking at about zero growth this year. And I would stress there are really big regional differences. Like I would say Ontario and Quebec would be in recession. Places like Saskatchewan, Alberta, and BC would be let off much more lightly. It would hurt them as well, but not nearly as much as central Canada. So it is serious stuff.
I'm wondering if you might be able to dive into what industries might be most at risk if the tariffs eventually do go into effect.
Yeah, and to be clear, this would be an attack and challenge on our producers, not our consumers. The consumers are really affected by what we do in retaliation and by any weakness in the Canadian dollar. But the direct effects of a tariff war, from US tariffs, I should say, are mostly directed at our producers. And it especially is tough on manufacturers that sell into the US or really integrated into the US. I would say resource companies generally, they're used to a lot of volatility in prices. They can sell to other places in the world. They're not necessarily beholden to the US. And as I said, energy was going to be let off with a 10% tariff in any event. So it's really the manufacturing sector. I would say autos first and foremost, it would have just been a mess, to put a technical word behind it. It would have been a real challenge for the auto sector. Of course, famously, some parts go back and forth across the border a number of times. A few voices were talking about the auto industry having to shut down, at least temporarily, in the face of tariffs, because I'm just not sure how they would have dealt with it. Other sectors that would have been really acutely affected would be aerospace, and I would say metals like steel and aluminum would be really directly hit as well.
Were we to get in an actual tit for tat tariff war with the United States imposing tariffs on us and us on them and potentially escalations, how would this impact consumers, maybe both in Canada and the United States?
Yeah, and to be clear, it's an asymmetric relationship. I mean, one way to look at it is how much of our GDP do we export to the US? It's about 20%. How much of the US GDP is exported to Canada? It's less than 2% of their economy. So, in a full-on trade war, it's pretty clear Canada's going to lose. We can inflict a bit of pain on the US, but we would be punished much more. The way our consumers would feel it is the extent to which we retaliate. And I think that's part of the reason why Ottawa's response was relatively measured. Like, they were going to impose 25% tariffs on about a quarter of what we import from the US, so much more limited than what the US was talking about. And I believe Ottawa was purposely picking items that Canadian consumers could substitute away from. Like, you don't have to buy US bourbon, you could buy Canadian rye, to use a rather silly but real world example. But they were purposely picking things that people could substitute out of, like, various items of clothing. The other way, though, it could hurt consumers, well, I mentioned the currency, and we had a taste of that. The Canadian dollar weakened a lot when it looked like there was going to be a trade war. It dropped around to 67 cents or so, the weakest it had been in more than 20 years. That would push up prices of a lot of things that we import across the board. That's also manageable, but it would affect all consumers. The third way it could affect consumers is the indirect channel, and that's through whether people actually lose their jobs. And, that's where the attack on producers could blow back onto the average Canadian consumer. For instance, if you had a manufacturer having to, temporarily lay people off, pull back on shifts, cut back on hours, or even close down, that's where it would really hurt the individual Canadian consumer is through job losses.
Oh, we announced a budget recently. How would a tariff war or a threat of tariffs impact the budget and government spending maybe more broadly at the federal level?
Well, and to be blunt, I think they were still working out how they would deal with it. I think both the feds and the provinces were trying to determine, how they could support individuals and businesses. At one point, people were talking about a COVID-like response. I don't think it would be that overwhelming by any means. Frankly, we don't have the budget to repeat that exercise. But I do think that governments would be looking for ways and using, the means that they have to support people who are laid off in industries that were affected directly. And yes, we would have our own tariff revenue. The kind of revenues that they were talking about, 25% on $155 billion worth of U.S. imports. I mean, on paper, that would suggest that Ottawa was going to raise about $38 billion in tariff revenue if people didn't adjust their spending behavior. That's a lot of money, which I'm sure they would have redistributed through different channels back to Canadians. So that's one way we could have helped support the economy. I would say that in a really tough situation, if we got on a full-on trade war with the U.S., the government does have some room to maneuver here. Our government finances aren't in great shape, but they're in good enough shape that, if we were in a crisis, they could run fairly large budget deficits. And I will say, by the way, there is room to increase defense spending, without necessarily cutting elsewhere. And that seems to me to be a pretty key ask by the U.S. I think there is room, there is scope to maneuver on that front.
Well, thank you for that. I'm wondering also if we might be able to discuss how tariffs might impact the North American economy more broadly? Obviously, we have a very integrated economy between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. What might happen in the event of a trade war, or even if we just have this looming threat of a potential trade war for the next month or so?
Yeah, those are two different issues. So we'll start with, how would the rest of the North American economy be affected in a full-on trade war? And Mexico's dependence on the U.S. economy is very similar to Canada, so they would have been affected in a similar way. If anything, they're even more integrated. Their auto sector is even more closely tied into the U.S. So I think the hit would have been slightly harder on Mexico. As I said, the U.S. There's no winners in the trade war. The U.S. would have been affected as well, but the hit on them would have been much lighter. Our estimate was that in the kind of retaliation we were looking at, the U.S. economy probably would have been dinged by about a quarter to a half a percent in growth both this year and next, and their inflation rate might have been pushed up by about a quarter to a half a percent as well. Neither of those things are good for the U.S., so they would have suffered a bit of a hit as well, but again, not nearly as serious as Canada and Mexico. Now, in this sort of foggy world where we're not sure, and the so-called sort of Damocles is hanging over us, that can weigh on growth too. Just because of the uncertainty for businesses, like it's tough to imagine any business that exports to the U.S. expanding at this point or investing. I mean, the trade backdrop is just so uncertain, I should say, that I can't see them investing. So I think that will weigh on the Canadian economy all by itself. So instead of 2% growth, we're thinking in Canada it's probably going to be closer to about 1.5 to 1.75%, and it might even be lower than that if we have to deal with this uncertainty all year long, even if we were never affected by U.S. tariffs. I don't think it really affects the U.S. to the same degree. There might be a little bit of uncertainty among U.S. businesses. It might, make them a little less reluctant to invest. But I think at the margin, even there, the uncertainty is not helpful.
We've we've seen kind of a level of patriotism in Canada that we arguably have not seen in maybe over a decade, at least several years. We're also seeing some sort of, I don't know if I would call it anti-Americanism, but some talks about making Canada more self-sufficient, perhaps diversifying its economic and trade partnerships. Where do you, standing where we are now, where do you see things going in the more medium to long term between the United States and Canada? A lot of people would say that our relationship is very strong, kind of regardless who's at the head of state level, and that hopefully calmer heads will prevail in the long term, and that something like a trade war is mutually disadvantageous. Maybe a tall order, but what do you predict happens now?
So I think we really should take this as a wake-up call on a number of fronts. One is not to be complacent at all with the U.S. relationship, and not to assume that, this some of the tension or the uncertainty might last beyond Mr. Trump. I don't believe he's alone in the Republican Party in having these concerns about the trade deficit and thinking that the U.S. has been treated unfairly and some of its allies are shirking its responsibilities. I don't think we can assume that, this is just Mr. Trump. It may be, but I don't think we can be complacent on that front at all and believe that this is just a 4-year thing. I think on the other side, I think we do have to take a long look and a quick look at what we can improve on our own end, how we can improve the structure of the Canadian economy. One thing that's been talked a lot in the last month or so has been about, knocking away or at least bringing down some of the interprovincial trade barriers. Absolutely. I mean, don't let a crisis go to waste. This is the time to seriously work on that. Not just that, also look at other ways we can improve the structure of our economy, whether it's, relooking at some of the regulatory aspects that are holding back, especially the natural resource sector. The taxation environment, I would say, is a bit inefficient. It is not encouraging of business investment. In terms of a diversifying our trade, by all means, I wouldn't hold out a lot of hope that we can, move the dial quickly there. It's interesting. Canada's exports to the U.S. have almost always been about 3/4 of our total exports have gone to the U.S. There's a theory of economic gravity or trade gravity that suggests that you will trade with the biggest market that's close to you. And frankly, there's a lot of products. It is hard to ship anywhere other than the U.S. I mean, well, first of all, the auto industry and the steel industry is very heavily integrated. Natural gas, unless you liquefy it, there's pretty much nowhere else we can send it other than the U.S. almost oil, it's very efficient to send it to the US and nowhere else. So in some ways, we can't change that. We can't change geography. Or economic history, but we should do what we can to try to diversify for sure. But we have been trying that for a long time. But yes, we should redouble our efforts on that front. I would personally like to focus more on what we can improve in our own economy, to somewhat reduce our dependency on trade with the U.S. and to strengthen our own economy.
Well, Mr. Porter, thanks for joining me today. It's been a really great conversation. We've crammed a lot of subtopics into just about 15 minutes here. One last thing, it's undoubtedly a very, I think, emotional time for a lot of Canadians, maybe some Americans too. It's a time of uncertainty. There's been lots of people in the media opining about this issue and what it means. If you could maybe impart some final piece of some knowledge or advice onto our more general audience, what might it be so to help them maybe understand this issue a bit more and what could be done?
Well, it is a very unusual set of circumstances, I must say. I think when we were negotiating the free trade agreement way back in the late 80s and then NAFTA in the mid 90s, I don't think anyone foresaw that we would have, someone in the White House who was, I don't want to say hostile, but um, who really didn't value the relationship as much with Canada in particular, and even with Mexico. Um, there are lots of theories as to what's motivating this, and I don't pretend to know exactly what the right answer is, but I do take the president at his partly at his word. I think there are three main factors driving this. One is I do think he is really wanting to reshore a lot of high value added manufacturing, like especially in the auto industry and in the even in the steel industry. Um, and yeah, that's kind of challenging to deal with. I think second of all, they really are looking for revenue, government revenues, and let's say they put a 10% tariff on all imports, they could raise $300 billion if there wasn't a huge change in buying behavior. That's not going to cancel the U.S. budget deficit, but it's a nice step in the right direction. And there's not much we can do about that if that really is the goal. And the third goal, which I think is what we've seen in real time, is to basically prompt countries to change their behavior and to get them to do things that the president wants to do, like tighten up the border. Now that one we can deal with. I think really what we should all do as Canadians is be strategic, stay calm, try to agree with the president where we can that makes sense and where it actually ultimately helps our economy, which I would, I think strengthening the border, I think we can all agree on that. But in other areas where we just do not agree, that, threatens our values or, what we stand for, I think we have to stand up. And if it involves a little bit of economic pain, then so be it.
Mr. Porter, thanks so much for joining me today. To close out today's episode, we spoke with Dr. Eric Duchesne, who discussed the impact of U.S. tariffs on Canada and global trade, as well as the need for Canada to diversify its trade relationships. So, with the U.S. imposing tariffs not just on Canada, but many other countries, and we're potentially looking at adding more to the list, could Canada's position in future trade negotiations be impacted, and how might our stance need to evolve if the U.S. continues to pursue what some might call protectionist policies?
Well, of course, we're living in a much different world. The general feeling by Canadians is that we have been stabbed in the back by a very close ally. We don't know how much we can trust the American administrations, although we do have very, very several friends south of the border. Among business people, a lot of think tanks. But what this means is that if Trump wants to play the card America first, and when we renegotiated NAFTA, we played the card, North America, North America first in some ways, showing that how much we were important to them. No, it's much tougher. I think, we have to start thinking about our own measures. I just said we have thought about lowering all the regulations and regulatory barriers inside. There have been even some ideas, and going back to idea of diversifications, even floating the idea of maybe at some point joining the European Union and all of that. But if we want to talk about diversifications, I think we have to be clear about what we mean, because there are two ways to look at diversifications. So one way is, and I think that's what most people would have in mind, is that we are too dependent on the United States, and we need to look at other supply chains. And to me, that amounts to de-risking. So it's not diversification, it's de-risking. Lowering the risk on our trades with the United States. And it's not as if we have not done diversification, because to me, diversification is, increasing our trade with a lot of different partners. We have trade agreement with all other G7 countries. So we have increased, obviously, because trade agreements are working extremely well. We have increased trade, lowered barriers with the United States, but not at the expense of the rest of the world. Now, we have diversified our economy through a lot of other agreements. So we are a trading nation, and we are increasingly a trading nation. So if we're talking about diversifications vis-a-vis the United States, I think the right word should be talking about de-risking. And the question is, is that really what we want? Or we say, is that worth, giving it another try and trying to reach out to the administrations? But it's extremely complicated. This morning, I was listening to an interview by Peter Navarro on MSNBC, and really, talking all the way back to the 19th century, when the context was completely different. Tariffs were a great source of revenue, and at the same time, United States had a growing population, new territories out west to explore, and it's a much different context now. If the Americans say, well, we want to, having companies relocalize, reshoring to the United States, while at the same time, having this purge on mass immigration, having workers, where are they going to take their workers? And be reminded, they're living in the past. Tariffs, they're putting tariffs to support, now apparently the workers, but workers in manufacturing constitute about 8 or 9% of the workers in the United States. It's a industrialized economy, even although certain tertiary sector in agriculture, forest industry, and all that. But basically putting those tariffs means that to support 8% of the US workers means that the other 91% are just going to pay more for their goods at Walmart. And if we want to talk, like, for instance, just take for instance, what happened when the United States put the 10% tariffs on aluminum and 25% tariff on steel. Obviously, it did help the steel industry in the United States. But what did they do? Did they raise wages for the workers? No. Did they say, well, we need to innovate, having more innovations? We have this windfall? No. They just passed down the increased prices to their consumers, took their profits and paid more dividends to investors. So that's trickle down economics for you. So again, if we expand that, all this idea of all those tariffs, and that Trump is saying, well, we're going to deregulate, drill, baby drill. We're going to lower taxes, but that's okay. We're going to compensate having foreigners pay for it by having those tariffs. But I'm sorry, the math don't add up. That's just like the lowering tariffs as he did during the first administrations. All that's going to do, tariffs are not even going to cover 10% of that. So I don't know in which world they're living in. They're living in the past. If making America great again means going back to the 19th century, well, good luck to them. But unfortunately, we're collateral damage. Now, having those tariffs targeting Canada and Mexico from the get-go, and then the next move is say, well, let's put tariffs on aluminum and steel. Where do they get their steel mostly? It's from Canada. Steel, aluminum, and those are products that they badly need. It's not like they can just turn around, produce it themselves, finding it and somewhere else. So it's going to be extremely chaotic for them. And what's making it worse is that when he's talking about this, he's talking about the entire supply chain. It's not just like raw steel and aluminum. He said, let's go down all the way down the chain, put tariffs on everything, and then not only that, and saying, yeah, but this time there won't be any exemption. And you know which states are the most affected by those tariffs? By and large, red states. The cost of the tariffs is twice as high in red states under Republican control than under Democratic control. So when he's saying there won't be any exemptions, I'm seeing all those governor or whatever steel producers in Texas. Texas is going to be the state that's going to be the most affected of all the states. Going on a golf course, with the President Mar-a-Lago or at the Oval Office and saying that doesn't make any sense because it's affecting our producers. You don't want to have any exemptions. May have some problems when in 2026 in the next midterm election. So I don't know what's going to give. I don't know what's going to give. Is that Peter Navarro's views that tariffs are great? Yeah, maybe a little bit of a tweak may hurt a little bit, but in the long run, we're going to make the United States so strong, that we're going to be able to undo all the bad policies for Biden. No, there won't be any inflation, or will there be some real damage? And then you're going to see coming those exemptions because you're going to have governors, elected official, especially in the House when they are in continual electoral mode. They're going to say, Mr. President, you're hurting us here. So I think that talking directly to them, when I heard Peter Navarro this morning, so if that's the view of Donald Trump, there's no point talking to them directly and showing them the numbers and whatever to say, those are all just alternative facts. You have your facts, we have our facts. But if it's coming from people who are pretty close to the president, business in the United States, governor, House representatives, especially in the red state, and that's where we need to do as Canadians. That's where we need to do our lobbying. So long response, but I would say there's still still more to say about all of this.
No, it's a great primer for our listeners. It is very in depth. So thank you for that, Mr. Duchesne. I'm wondering if maybe in the 5 or so minutes we have left, could you maybe speak a bit to some of the global ramifications? Like what I'm understanding from you is that you seem to be implying that this probably isn't a sustainable path for the United States. There'll be a lot of pain and perhaps some reorientation. I mean, I don't want to imply too much, but that seems to be a kind of part of what you're saying. So even if this is just a brief moment in the history of the United States, these tariff threats and these tariff wars with their allies,
Yeah.
how is the world looking at the United States now? Like, what are its allies thinking, and what are the global ramifications of the United States trying to pursue this more insular path where it's applying tariffs towards its allies across the board, and like, will it have any ripple effects throughout the international economic system and trading system?
Oh, that's really a big question. So I'll answer it in kind of in two parts. The first part is more and more. Some people are saying that the United States is already a rogue state. Now, there are a lot of characteristics of it. I'm not sure if I'm ready to call the United States a rogue state, but there's definitely a lot of tendency going towards that. That would be the first thing. So if it's a rogue state, then sometimes when that happens, we need some sanctions against them. We're not seeing sanctions so much now because Donald Trump, for now, is that big bully in the schoolyard, picking up on the small ones. In that case, could be Canada, Mexico. We saw what he did with Colombia, few others, and then. But the problem with that, when you give him, there are two parts. You give in to him, you give him your school lunch, and then he's going to complain that he doesn't want any bologna sandwich. You better have tomorrow. Bring me some salami or steak or whatever. He's always going to be asking for more. And then you have others around them, around the bully. They say, should I come to the defense of poor little Canada or poor little Mexico? Yeah, but if I do, I'm going to be the next target. Things may change at the point where he's talking about having tariffs against the European Union. The Europeans are looking at that. They commiserate with Canadians, but they say, well, let's not do anything to upset the bully. That may change. Maybe there'll be some kind of stronger coalitions. I hope so, vis-a-vis the United States. Second point is that I subscribe to a large extent to what Ian Bremmer says. We are in a G0 world. So we're past Pax Americana. So hegemonic power, we recognize it in three different ways. They're powerful. They have a lot of means. That's the case for United States. That's the case for China. They have the willingness to be the international policeman, make sure we have a stable currency, make sure that we have a stable economic system, trading system. China might be a bit more committed to some of those aspects, although they're playing a lot in the gray zones. Donald Trump is completely pulling away from that. They're both powerful, willingness, I don't see the willingness on the side of the United States. It remains to be seen for China. And third, there's the aspect that, are others willing to follow? If they're not willing to follow, I'm not sure that too many are willing to follow China, and less the United States. So in the view of Donald Trump, his leadership is not as hegemonic power, is as a neo-imperialist power. My way or your way. So there's nothing benevolent behind that. So we're back in some ways to the 1930s, where there was a lack of leadership in the international system after the Americans imposed the Smoot-Hawley, the very prohibitive Smoot-Hawley tariff, retaliations from a lot of other countries. And then, we know what happens after that. Lack of coordinations on trade issue, lack of coordinations then on security issue, appeasement, vis-a-vis Hitler, Tojo, Mussolini. I'm not saying that we're going towards another world war, but we're entering a very, very dangerous world. A G0 world without leadership. If everyone, no one wants to get too close to China. I'm not sure if China wants to exert that type of leadership. We can't trust the American anymore, and there's not enough of a willing coalition. Now, being Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Europeans, and that, to bring some kind of a counterbalance to the two giants, the panda and the eagle.
A world order with unclear international leadership. Dr. Duchesne, thanks for joining us for the podcast today. Good to have you on. That brings us to the end of today's special episode of the Expert Series. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platforms so you never miss an update. For more in-depth analysis and updates on national security and defense, be sure to visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca, where you can find articles, reports, and more. Thanks for listening, and thanks once again to our guests. We hope you'll be tuning in next time.